Edward Zoll and Doc Burkhart are here to discuss some disturbing news published today by the South China Morning Post about these joint experiments by Chinese and Russian scientists in manipulating the Earth's atmosphere. Gentlemen, I've been talking about this for 20 years.
Yes.
You know, we started out in 1999 talking about HAARP.
Right.
And if you mentioned HAARP, you were called a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist because nobody wanted to admit that in the so-called mainstream media, they didn't even want to admit that HAARP existed.
That's right.
Let alone that it was doing any kind of atmospheric experiments. So now here we are today, and I want to put up on the screen, this is the South China Morning Post newspaper headline. South China Morning Post, excellent newspaper in Hong Kong. I read it every day. Great source of news for the Asian area. And the headline says, China and Russia band together on controversial heating experiments to modify the atmosphere.
This isn't the National Enquirer.
No, South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. Now, if True News published a story that said U.S. government working on heating, doing heating experiments to modify the atmosphere, then the New York Times and the Washington Post and Huffington Post, they would mock us.
Right.
True News spreading wild conspiracy theories. But here it is today. That's the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong.
Well, Rick, we're not studying a graduate program in plasma physics. That's the difference. Is that not only do we now know that this has been going on for more than 30, 40 years, the Chinese have at least started doing this since 2012. But the thing that concerns me about this story, Rick, is that the scientists themselves, actually Professor Go Lixin, the Dean of School of Physics and Optoelectronic Engineering at Zhejiang University in Zhejiang Province in China, he said it's incredibly rare for China to work with another country, especially even Russia, to do an experiment like this, which raises the prospect, one, why are they now writing so openly about it? And two, what do the Chinese and Russians know that we, as Americans in the West, are refusing to accept?
It's interesting because it's openly discussed in the Asia region. They're not hiding it.
That's right.
But in the United States, if you discuss it, you're mocked. You're ridiculed. You're called a conspiracy theorist, and most of the, I would say 95% of the American people have never heard of HAARP.
Right.
They don't know that it exists.
The High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, located up in Alaska, has been in operation now for a couple decades. And there was a gap in time there where it shut down for just a little while. It supposedly shut down, but now it's active again. But I remember various programs, including yours, Rick, that talked about HAARP long ago, back in the 90s, early 2000s.
I used to interview Nick Begich.
Yes. Yeah, he had the book, Angels Don't Play That HAARP.
That's right.
So, yeah. And
that's a good title. I haven't read the book.
Nick Begich was the first person to come out and really make a case about what had been built in Alaska. And again, he was ridiculed. But a number of us have talked about it.
And I remember them denying the facility even existed.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes.
There's no such facility like this. That's all, imagination. And then it turns out it was true. And
well, there was a day, Doc, if you talked about the NSA, people said it meant no such agency.
Right.
Which we now know to be in itself a conspiracy because it absolutely exists, and now we've had to accept its existence along with its violation of our Fourth Amendment rights here in America. But I think the biggest takeaway, Rick, from this is that you look at the capability of this technology. Don't say just the capability that Chinese are admitting to. One of them is that on a test on June 12th, they're claiming they were able to heat up the ionosphere. Now, the ionosphere separates Earth's atmosphere with space. They were to heat the temperatures at 100 degrees Celsius.
212 degrees Fahrenheit.
Incredible.
Yes.
Boil water.
Yes.
Let's say there are a lot of nations that are in the northern hemisphere that rely on snow and snowstorms to be able to produce the rainwater that they'll have for farming, for example, in the spring and summer. let's say the military application of this, if it were to be used like this, could be it being deployed over, let's say, North America, another farming area, maybe against Russia. And the country would not be able to farm for a season or two.
Could you argue that the Chinese and the Russians are actually preparing for an ice age?
Well, we were talking about that before the Godcast began today, that if you knew that the upper ionosphere was cooling down because of lower sunspot activity, wouldn't you want to have a device that could actually warm it back up? And that's exactly what this would be. That's what HAARP would be, and that's what this device would be as well, the ability to reheat the ionosphere that had cooled down.
And we know that the Chinese are building an artificial sun and artificial moons.
Yes.
So the Chinese are being very proactive right now in developing science capabilities of affecting the atmosphere either over China. If it's a more sinister purpose, then they're looking for ways to change the atmosphere over other nations. So going back to this South China Morning Post, so they're talking about a Russian base called Sura. Sura is kind of like the American HAARP, and so the Russians have been conducting atmospheric heating experiments actually going back to the Soviet days.
That's correct. And this is a facility they've resurrected of sorts, if they ever stopped, let's say. But the article notes that this was a resurrected facility near Vasil-Sursk. And the part that I felt was incredibly interesting with this is that the amount of power it takes. You know, there are a lot of talk about HAARP in the past is that one way you could prove it was to just show a large influx of power going out to a remote area. There would be no reason, for example, one of the things they said here is the Sur facility, Vasil-Sursk in Eastern Russia, in Eastern Europe rather, produced the same amount of power as a small city. This is the amount of power being used to affect the atmosphere, but in other words, this would be used to heat and even to power the homes of a city.
Well, when they heated, and this is just months ago, June of this year, when they heated the ionosphere, it was 49,000 square miles. That's like half the size of Great Britain.
Right.
So technically, they have the capability of warming up a nation, at least half of a nation the size of Great Britain. Now, could you double the heat? Could you triple the heat?
It all would require the amount of energy that you put into the system.
Yes.
And I read in the South China Morning Post article where they were trying to explain how this works, that the waves are sent out and bounces off the ionosphere like a mirror, but that's not quite right. What it's actually doing, it's hitting the atmosphere and bouncing. Well, it's more like a ball hitting a wall. There's energy being transferred from the ball to the wall, and the ball bounces, right? It's the same thing with these energy waves. The energy is being transferred as it hits the ionosphere. So even in shortwave, for instance, shortwave radio, it bounces off the ionosphere. There is some activity that actually occurs when the waves hit the ionosphere. It all depends on how much energy is put into the system. If you put 1,000 watts in, you get so much energy. You put 1,000,000 watts in, that does a bigger job at heating up the ionosphere. But there still is you can't deny the laws of physics. Physics will transfer energy to someplace else. That's why the waves diminish as they continue to bounce down the lane.